Welcome to a special edition of Crossbody of Work. My name is Evan,
I am Javier.
and it's a special edition because it's not just the two of us. Instead, we are joined by the author of the six-pack on the open road in search of WrestleMania, Brad Balukjian. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Evan, Javier, how are you?
We are
Doing well.
thrilled you're here. We got to read the book. We got to read the six-pack, and now we get to talk to you about it. We are so happy you're here. This is a first for us to interview an author. It feels very smart. We feel very important. But we're thrilled because a book that is truly for wrestling fans, that is a really an ode to an era of wrestling. We talk about old wrestling all the time. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of the book and kind of the origins of your wrestling fandom?
Yeah, it's I've been thinking about how this book now is covering stuff that's more than 40 years old in some cases, and in a sense that would seem like pretty bode pretty poorly for having any kind of relevance today. But I think that the reason why it does resonate with a lot of people is even if you weren't around back in the early to mid 80s, you probably have heard that the whole Hulkamania phenomenon that started beating the Iron Sheik in 1984. You can kind of draw a line from that to where we are today in wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
And even if again you aren't that familiar with the 80s WWF explosion, it really kicks off the what I would call the modern era of wrestling being more about entertainment than trying to portray itself as sport. A lot of people may not realize that, like when I was growing up in the 80s watching, I mean, I knew my dad right from the jump. He's like, this is not real sport. And I think I mean, I intellectually knew that, but I still would get sucked into it, and you sort of
Yeah.
suspend your disbelief. And the presentation was different back then. It was a little more grounded in on the mat and in reality. You didn't have quite the same degree of backflips and moonsaults and everything. And of course the promoters, they said this was an actual competition. This was real sport. I mean, it wasn't until the late 80s that the promoters started to openly admit that it was entertainment, it was a show. And then things changed quickly from there. But yeah, I grew up loving the Iron Sheik. He was my favorite wrestler. He was my hero. I got to know him personally when I was in college through just a lot of my dogged pursuit of trying to find him and get to know him. Went through all these. I got into it a little bit in the book, in the prologue, about how I tracked him down through his agent, and I got to meet him at a autograph signing in Secaucus, New Jersey. And next thing you know, he's just smoking buckets of marijuana in front of me, and high out of his mind, 4 in the morning, asking me to drive us in my shitty 93 Ford Escort to a 24-hour diner. It was quite an introduction to the Iron Sheik, but that was the beginning of a very interesting relationship, because a few years later I tried to write a book with him and left my job at a magazine.
Yeah.
And that's when the death threats happened and things went sideways. And fast forward to a couple of years ago, when I had done a successful book about tracking down baseball players, and I said, well, why don't I revisit that theme but with wrestling and try to go find the Iron Sheik again many years later, and also other wrestlers that were there when he won the championship. And that's the six pack, or the people like Sergeant Slaughter and Tito Santana, other wrestlers that were on the card. And really the book's about the extent to which they became their characters and kind of who they are in real life.
And it's a really interesting entry point to the book. I also realized you and I have the same first car, a 93 Ford Escort.
Maybe it was the actual same car.
That wouldn't surprise me either, with the roll down windows. When you talk about rolling a window and you do this, nobody
Tape
under the
deck,
age of 30 knows what you're doing.
tape deck, no auto locks, roll
Yeah.
windows. Yeah.
And it was fine.
That was fine.
It moved. That's all you needed.
It actually was, probably better than some other cars I've had since that are fancier. So,
And so
My
you
first
mentioned
car was a 2013 Honda Civic.
oh
Ooh,
my
good
goodness.
car.
I got it like 5 years ago. So,
Your first car was in 2013. It's 20 years older or newer. Good for you.
All right, well, it wasn't in 2013. I would have been like I was like 16, but no, I didn't have a car.
So obviously you had to revisit the idea of doing a book on the Iron Sheik because you talk about in the book how you had this idea when you were younger of 100% going to do the biography. The death threats from the Iron Sheik happen in front, not even online death threats. People get those all the time. These were in your face
Yeah,
death threats.
right. No mistaking it. Like multiple choice. How do you want to die? He got really angry when I just fact checked him about a very trivial thing, and
Yeah.
he was just really volatile at that point. Deep into the addiction, and so little things could set him off. I mean, there were moments of clarity, and I think that's why I always knew and deep down that he this wasn't really him. That the real Khosrow Vaziri, his real identity is a very very different person, and
Hmm.
ultimately I'm glad that person came back at the end, and that he was able to kind of come full circle in his life.
Was it hard for you to find a new starting point? Like before, obviously the goal was to do the biography on Sheik, but instead, like, was it hard for you to kind of find it, or did you think like, well, I'll do something similar to the Wax Pack and just kind of bring
Yeah,
it in?
I think the Wax Pack provided some of the template for how to do a book about a road trip to find my childhood heroes. But this was different. The Wax Pack had a little more randomness because, like, other than these 15 players being in the same pack of cards, they don't necessarily have anything in common. So
Yeah.
I figured, well, if I write about the guys that were on the show when Iron Sheik became the champion, I have some kind of cohesion between them, and I can also tell the story of how Vince McMahon Jr. built the company from this regional territory to this national behemoth. And the Iron Sheik story is intertwined with that, and Hulk Hogan and all of that. So it was also, there was some structure around, as a secondary story, telling the expansion of the WWF story.
And when it comes to like, meeting these wrestlers, like especially, all these years later after the height of their fame and all this other stuff, what kind of, what was it kind of like seeing how they sort of blended, you know, who they actually are with somehow like with the retelling of stories and stuff, and seeing like, Tony Atlas bringing out Tony Atlas, or like Sheik bringing out Sheik, like how did
Mhm.
you see sort of them kind of, telling the story straight, like from their actual, shoot
Mhm.
perspective, versus sort of trying to keep kayfabe alive a little bit.
Yeah, and I think all these guys, no matter how much, like, they never quite fully blend in. Like
Yeah.
there's something about, I don't know if it's because we saw them on TV so much, but when you see a former wrestler in person, there's just a certain presence they have, even years later, that just kind of catches you. They stand out. They're something about their aura or something. So I think even the guys that are more well adjusted in the latter part of their life, they still, there's so much of that performer still in them that it is hard for them to completely detach from that. I mean, Tito Santana, when I met him at his house in New Jersey, I didn't. I mean, I did all this research on his upbringing in Texas, and up through into his mid 20s, he went by his real name, which was Merced Solis.
Yeah.
And so everyone in Texas call, his family, they all call him Merced. Then he becomes Tito Santana with totally fictional name. And I have no idea. It's kind of awkward. Like, I didn't know when I went up to shake his hand, like, what do I call him? I don't know
Yeah.
what he even goes by. And then to find out that his wife, Leah, who he's been with for, 40 years or so, 40 some years, she calls him Tito because when they met, he was already a wrestler. They met at a bar. He introduced himself as Tito. So it's like, I mean, that's kind of weird to me that, like, even your wife would call you your stage name, but that's
Yeah.
the level at which this character penetrated their identity.
And I think you're right. Like nobody wrestler's job is to go to a massive room and work the room, whatever way they're working, right? If they're working heel, they're trying to get heat. If they're working babyface, they're trying to get the crowd behind them. So you're right that like there's no way for them to not stand out. They're used to walking into a room and immediately trying to elicit some sort of reaction
Right.
without knowing people personally. So I can see that making it really hard for them to.
Well, I think probably like when a writer comes to them, and I think a lot of probably a lot of journalists, a lot of writers who would interview these wrestlers, they want to ask them more about the angles and the
Yeah,
storylines. So they're more accustomed to that. But I'm coming at them and asking more personal stuff a lot of the time, or about their family life. And so I think sometimes that can kind of catch them off guard, or they may not be used to answering those things. And maybe it is hard for them to answer those things as their real identity, right? As
yeah,
their, versus what would Anthony White say here versus Tony. I mean, and even in that chapter, at one point he says like Anthony White is gone,
yeah,
or he said something like when he was, we go to the assisted living where his wife was, and everyone, he's cracking jokes, and he's making little one liners, and people are recognizing him as Tony Atlas. And he said something afterwards in a very reflective moment where he was like, these people want to see Tony Atlas. They don't want to see Anthony White.
yeah.
Yeah.
And,
When we went to the restaurant for lunch, I mean, again, this wasn't planned. We walk into a restaurant with the town that he lives, and this person is requesting a selfie, and then this person is paying for his lunch, and this is just a Tuesday or something, right? Um, it's got to mess with your head a little bit, like
yeah,
to know that these people, they're not really like they're in love with a fantasy version of you, but that's not really you,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. And
That's
it's
got to.
weird how that works out, because like you don't really see that in any other form of like sport or entertainment. Like, I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio is like as bigger than life as it gets, probably as an actor, but no one goes up to him and is like, "Hey, Jordan Belfort, what's up?"
Right.
Like, you
You
know.
well, you definitely know that some complete douchebag frat bro has absolutely done that. You're Jordan Belfort.
Yeah,
But
like
other than
it's
that,
just weird
yeah,
how that works in wrestling. Like you don't see even relatively similar things like MMA. Like Conor McGregor isn't going out there. Well, maybe that's probably not the best example, because I
Well,
feel
I
like
think
Conor's crossover is probably the exact same. But there are people who like go up in the performative way to sort of sell themselves to audiences. And then probably behind the scenes are just like a normal person who's just like, yeah, I'm not actually like Sean O'Malley's not like, yeah, you can call me Sugar. Like he's probably just like, no, my name's Sean.
right. Well, I think someone like John Cena might have it easier because he's John Cena. I mean, that's his
yeah,
real
Yeah.
name, right? He's not, and his character was not. I mean, it was like an exaggerated version, but it's not like he's this total gimmick.
Yeah.
yeah. Whereas Iron Sheik, as you detail in the book, like very different than the man that is actually playing Iron Sheik. Like two very different folks. So that's got to be really difficult for him to turn on and off.
Right, and with him, it's especially complicated because here he in real life, Khosrow Vaziri is one of the most patriotic wrestlers of all time. I mean, he coached the U.S. Olympic wrestling team. He defected. He left Iran. He wanted out. He was afraid of his circumstances when one of his friends mysteriously died. Who
Yeah,
was like a folk hero in Iran, and he got on a plane without speaking any English in 1969 and came to the U.S. and really, other than one brief visit, never went back to
yeah,
Iran. And it's interesting too. Like I was able to talk to a journalist in Iran, and again, it's sometimes I think in the U.S. we take for granted certain liberties, but like it's crazy that here in 2024, like a writer in Iran is like wouldn't let me identify him because he's like the press is not free over there. I mean,
yeah.
it's a complete censored society,
And
and he was like, you have to understand, like in 1984, at the height of the Iron Sheik's popularity, no one in Iran even knew who he was.
yeah,
Like they didn't even know, like there was no access to Western TV or culture. There's no internet. So it's just kind of funny that in on TV here you had the Iron Sheik saying, he's going to take the belt back to Iran to the Ayatollah. Meanwhile, people in Iran, and then if anyone did know about him, they thought it was a disgrace. You know, they
Yeah.
didn't like him because like you're making a mockery of our culture.
Yeah. And one of the things I want to talk about, because we've kind of been around it a little bit so far as we've been talking, is you mentioned the boys have a tendency to stretch the truth, we'll
Sure.
say,
Yeah.
through Hulk Hogan saying how many people were in attendance at WrestleMania 3, and that Andre weighed 700 pounds. Tony Atlas saying that the ledge he fell off was 10 feet off the
Right.
ground when it is very not. Does that make your job harder trying to write the book?
Oh, 100%. I mean, that's the hardest part of all was, I mean, that's really one of the goals of the book is to write a shoot about a work,
Yeah.
right? And in a culture that has like almost no written history,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and it relies on a lot of retelling of stories. I don't think, I mean, I'm sure I didn't get everything 100% right, but I tried really hard by consulting a lot of sources and talking to multiple people and fact checking in real time if somebody said something that didn't seem accurate. But yeah, it's a lot harder to like do background research. Like for a baseball book, well, there's every single newspaper in America
Yeah.
had a sports section that covered baseball, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's only so many articles that Dave Meltzer's going to put out there that
Right. And so
really
like
align
so
with
I
what you're
mean,
looking for.
Meltzer is interesting because I understand like some people's criticisms of Meltzer, but at the same time, like if it wasn't for the Observer, whatever you think of Meltzer, there's a ton of information in those early years that was
Yeah.
put on
Yeah.
paper that says like, okay, this event happened in this town, and this is the attendance, and like that is like the best thing we have to like a historical record, really.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just going to be Hulk Hogan saying there were a million people in attendance. Like it's
Yeah,
just going to keep getting ballooned higher and higher. It's good to have something written down.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And you circling back to your interactions with Sheik, when you're there talking to him, and he compares himself to Sylvester Stallone as
yeah.
far as star power goes.
Within five
Does
seconds of meeting him, yeah.
Yeah, does that sort of just like immediately justify all the emotional capital that you invested in him from an early age? Just like, oh, this guy really okay, he's awesome.
Well, actually, I would say the opposite. Like, maybe that seems weird, but it was more like the first sign because I think that was probably the first time I had really met a wrestler, a famous wrestler, like outside the context of the show,
Yeah.
and it was like almost I think a wake up call that like, oh no, these guys are kind of delusional, like it's cool that like to meet the Iron Sheik, but uh, it was the first sense that I think a lot of wrestlers that they're stuck in their own celebrity sometimes because they don't know how to let go of that character.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that was probably my reaction to that.
And would you say that was kind of like your I mean, every wrestling fan has that at a certain point in their life is sort of like the bubble bursting moment where,
Mm.
these figures who you hold in such high regards because they're
Well,
entertaining you
certainly
on a
driving
weekly
him to buy
basis.
crack was definitely a bubble bursting moment.
I didn't know where that was going to go in the because I think that was in the prologue, and I'm reading through it. And I'm like, is the Iron Sheik getting crack? I
Yeah.
didn't I didn't think that's
Yeah,
where
I mean,
this
I
was
think I
going.
think like my editors were very wary of me being overly descriptive, let's say, in those
Fair.
sections. But you can read between the lines, and yeah, I mean, I was driving him, and he was getting hard drugs. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't like walking up to the door with him, and like, you know, I
And
was
I'm
yeah,
Brad.
I was like keeping the Honda Accord warm, and but yeah, no, I mean that was, and I did write about that in the prologue that like I really felt, and I still do feel bad about that. Like, it doesn't matter how much of a fan you are. It's messed up to like help someone in, it, they're not helping themselves if you're enabling their addiction. Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think it was fair for him to put me in that position of asking me for money all the time, but
No.
I was a grown adult. I did that.
It's still, but it plays on the fandom, right? Of like, hey, this guy really likes me. I bet I
Well,
could
and
get
then
him
you
to drive
realize,
me.
like Tony Atlas talks about this, like, and these guys, they lived the life
Hmm.
because there were so many fans willing to do whatever. I mean,
Yeah,
drive them around, get them women, get them drugs, get, discounted hotels, rent free cars.
Yeah.
And sometimes we forget. I mean, I forget. Writing these books about guys that in their prime were in their 20s and early 30s. Like I mean, no offense to you, I don't know how old you guys are, but you're kind of an idiot when you're in
You're
your
not wrong.
20s versus when you're in your 60s, right?
as
Like
somebody
you're
who's out of his 20s now, I agree, hundred
like I
percent.
mean, I was an idiot. I mean, like you're young, but none of us had the level of fame. So imagine like how you are in your 20s, but then add in all this fame and adulation. Like it's no wonder that almost nobody keeps a level head.
Yeah, and like just that level of access to just whatever you want at any time.
And I think where WWE has where the culture's gotten better and healthier is, and there's still plenty of reform that needs to happen in wrestling and WWE, but um, the fact that their schedule is not as crazy, the fact that it's now like it's a Wall Street publicly traded company.
Yeah,
There's more corporate responsibility. I mean, there was no HR department in the WWF in 1980. Like, they just literally didn't exist,
yeah.
right? And so you can imagine in this environment what kinds of things went on. And I got into that a little bit with like the Middle East tours and the plane ride,
Oh yeah.
and that's only the tip of the iceberg from that era.
Want to talk about the plane ride later? Definitely. And that actually brings up a good point. The good question I had, which is, what are your thoughts on how the wrestling industry has changed since the time you were a fan through the 2000s, everything to now, the last few years? You know, Vince stepping away, AEW's emergence, the way that wrestling is kind of conducted now.
Mhm.
Do you like? What do you think about the changes to the industry, and what changes do you still kind of want to see in the wrestling industry from a fan perspective?
Well, wrestling is now firmly a TV commodity,
Hmm.
right? I
Yeah.
think that's different than what it was for the first 80 years of its existence. But now it's an entertainment commodity that is everything through TV and internet. You know, so it's going from a model of where like the live events were the basis. Things are very different now, and so there's got to be different emphasis placed on production and distribution and all these things. In terms of, I was talking to Dave Meltzer on his show, and he was asking me something similar, and I was saying that I don't relate as much to the in ring product as I did as a kid, because to me it's lost a little bit of the psychology.
Hmm.
Because if a guy hits his finisher like six times, it's like, what's okay, the seventh one works, like who cares? Like, I felt like WrestleMania, the matches are great. I mean, it's so much more impressive, the athleticism, but I'm trying to think like any of those marquee matches, if you're kicking out over and over and over
Yeah.
again at 2 3/4, it just takes the impact of the moves and lowers it. And
Yeah.
Dave had a good point, which he was like, well, yeah, but to some extent, all of us will always over romanticize the thing we liked when we were kids. And that's true. Like,
Yeah.
I grew up on the 80s product, so I'm comparing it to that. And I don't even know if it's possible at 43 to love wrestling as much as I did when I was a kid, because there was something about the product that was kids driven.
Yeah. And like I started watching it when it was not kids driven, Attitude Era, and Javier was Ruthless Aggression. Like we're all gonna love our era. Like whatever era was our era is gonna be the one we
Well,
default
so,
to.
so like, what do you guys think about that thing I was talking about with like all the false finishes? Does that bother you?
I, to an extent, yes. I think it's just become like part of the deal. Like I
Yeah,
think I now would just expect it. It does change when I see something end after one finisher. I'm like, oh, okay, like that's the surprise now. It's not that the finisher happened, but that it didn't take four; it took
right.
one. So I like when they are able to kind of subvert that way. But I think I just take it as part of the deal now. I don't know about you, Javi.
I think for me a lot it's not as like impactful for me because I pretty early on, like I was only like 12, 13 years old watching like Ring of Honor in the mid late 2000s, early 2010s, and like New Japan and all that stuff. So like you see that style of wrestling
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it is a lot of like hitting your finisher, so you have to somehow make your moves even bigger as you go, especially if it's like a
Right.
series of matches where this is like you're now in like the third match you've had with this person over the last stretch of months. Like one finisher's not going to get it done. And I am still, I guess this is just kind of a personal thing. I'm one of those people that like, even though I know I'm an internet wrestling fan.
Right.
Like clearly we have this podcast. Like I'm in the know as far as like, I know this one finisher isn't going to end the match, but when the person kicks out at 2 3/4, I'm still going to have a reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what popped in my head was it's much more like video game-ish to me
Yes,
now.
that's
Like,
fair.
Yeah.
again, I don't play video game, but I see them, and like, and you play a video game, you're killing lots of people, you're getting, it's like constant stimulation. So I could see where if you didn't grow up like I did with that era that I had, it's like there's still suspension of disbelief and there's still suspense because it's like, okay, when is it going to happen? When is the finish going to happen? Right.
Yeah,
That becomes
Yeah.
the point of anticipation. Like, ooh, he just did that. Okay. Even if he did it 7 times, like, will it be the eighth or the ninth or it's, and I can get that because I watched the match and I still into it. I'm like, okay, what's going to be the finish? And because they're so into subverting expectation, there's always like that challenge of what crazy thing is going to happen
yeah.
next.
Or
I will
like
say one good thing.
Seth versus Drew, this from WrestleMania, like starting with the Claymore. Like Drew hits the Claymore to start the match, and I'm like, that's different. There you
Yeah,
go. That's,
no, that's good. So okay, but here's some little things. I mean, I appreciate that you guys are different ages and eras, so you can tell me how you think, what you think about this. But one thing I was thinking watching WrestleMania was, what if they made the counting by the referee, not the pinfall, but counting outside the
mhm.
ring, more like it used to be, which
Yeah.
it was always a little bit fishy, whatever. But
Yeah,
now, like, guys will go out there for like 4 minutes, and it's like it's just a
Yeah.
joke that the referee is counting.
yeah.
But think about if you actually enforced it more, like that could create suspense.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's something that New Japan does really well. Is they are
Very
legit
well.
with their 20 counts, and so it's something we've noted on the podcast covering different eras and different brands of wrestling. Is that like, why aren't people counting?
Yeah,
It's a very
Yes.
simple concept.
It is such a notorious. It like I went to an AEW show when they came through to Boston a while back, and it infuriated me every time they went to the outside and the referee was just standing there, and
Just
at
saying,
no point, it's
right.
not even like they started the count late, they just never did a count. Like the
Well, even
wrestlers got
in
back into the ring and it was fine.
at WrestleMania, like when they would go into the corner up on the ropes, they're not counting. Some of them referees are not counting
yeah,
anymore.
Yeah.
Like, so those, like the rules are kind of
yeah.
ignored,
The
right?
thing that give it a little bit of the more legitimacy. This is a
Right.
competition; it must fall within these parameters. Is kind of being left to the side, and that's something we like going back and watching all these different wrestlers through their matches. Is like this week we're covering the Wild Samoans. Very different type of wrestling than anything
Yes.
happening right now. Like seeing
Right.
Alpha and Sika in the '80s, like it was very different than any sort of tag match right now. But you have to appreciate it for what it was. So you
Right.
can see a lot of modern fans who go back and look at it and go like, this is boring and nothing happens. It's only 8 minutes long and they hit two chops. Like, no, it's different. It's meant to be that way.
Notoriously did not use tag ropes either, those two guys.
No, they did not believe in tag ropes, but
Well, they still. I mean, guys still do use tag ropes now, right?
that's true.
They,
Yeah, it depends.
yeah.
Depends on who's out there.
Yeah. While we're talking about modern wrestling, what is your favorite match of the last 10 years?
Ooh, 10 years. Now you're exposing my lack of watching it consistent. I mean, I don't even know. I will say that I can't pick a match in the last 10 years, but I can tell you who I like in
Yeah.
terms of the current guys is I like Austin Theory, which
Ooh,
like
fair. Okay.
like most people are like, what? Like that is like
Ooh.
that's kind of like the maybe it's saying you like the Iron Sheik in 1985, right? Like not a popular take.
What about him?
He's a good wrestler. I'll give you that. He's a
I
real good
think
wrestler.
I just think he's I think he has like the it factor that
That's fair.
whether he'll become a big star, I don't know. But when I just saw his like something about his presentation, I was like, oh, this guy's like he really makes you want to hate him. Like, and not like, but not like
True.
cheer him, you know. And I actually really like Gunter
Yes.
Yeah.
because he's again like I like that he's a true heel.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like so
Talk
many
about a
of the
throwback.
right, so many of the heels now are popular,
Yeah.
right? Like even like is Triple H was he ever a heel or a face? Like
Oh, Triple
Oh,
H was 100% a heel. 100% a
okay,
heel.
but I feel like even when he was a heel, he would get cheered by like
it was
40% of the
only
crowd.
when he
It
had
was
his reign of terror in
it was
the
not
mid
by me, I can tell
2000s.
you that.
Yeah, when he had his reign of terror with the world heavyweight title for a number of years and like going over Booker T at WrestleMania and things like that. Like that's when he was in true heel mode because it was
Okay.
also his status of being the husband of Stephanie
Yeah.
definitely gave him different heel heat that is unattainable for other people.
Okay, what about like 2016 on Triple H?
No, because we knew he was playing a role and he still would do cool stuff. So I think
He also just wasn't around much.
yeah,
Yeah.
it all depends. But I do like we talk about like the throwback heels, people who were genuinely like, no, you're not supposed to like me at all.
Like you don't see little kids or anyone with a Gunter t-shirt.
No, you
I
just
don't know
see
if there is a Gunter t-shirt.
that's true. I can't
Never
think
seen
of a
any Imperium t-shirts out there.
I will say, like, from the crowd at WrestleMania, like, certain matches were 50-50. Like, 100% heels and baby faces were both getting chance. Certain matches, though, everyone was against the heel. Gunter, people were very much against Gunter.
I also think it's interesting that Imperium, it's like now because the way the world has changed, you know, like one guy's from Germany or a bunch from Austria, right? But
Yeah.
like they're not going to vilify someone for being like a German. So now they're just this like amorphous, ambiguous fascists, right? Right? They're like European fascists, and they like come out, and all their mannerisms are very like Nazi-ish,
Yeah.
but they're not going to outright say that
No.
because
It's the elitism. That's what it is. People don't like them because they're elitist.
no, that's
They're
true.
all
But there's
prim and
another
proper.
that's true, but it may be more like older fans feeling this way. But there's definitely hints of that like
Oh yeah.
fascism, you know.
Yeah, like, if this was like, some years ago, they would just be like, "You're all German." Be like,
Right,
"You're
Yeah.
Italian, you're Austrian, you're German. You're all German,
right.
and you're all gonna have a German gimmick."
Exactly, right. So I
And
think
you're now a
it's interesting
commander.
that they're still playing to some extent that in a subtle way that foreign heel
Yeah.
idea, but it's 2024 style, right?
Yeah.
And when sort of looking at the business in sort of through the modern lens, there's the last 40 years of wrestling have really been synonymous with one guy, and that's Vince McMahon Jr.
Sure.
And when you write when writing the book, there's a lot of it does come in sort of the overlap period because there were guys who were under Vince Senior and guys who were under Vince Junior and guys who were around for both. When like going through everything, collecting all the information that you could, having all these interviews, what were sort of what were some differences that you sort of noticed between the two Vince's father and son?
Right. I mean, I would love to I, I would love to be able to interview. Obviously, you can't like Vincent J, Vincent Senior, and Vincent K, Vincent Junior about their relationship because they seem like such vastly different people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The biggest thing is pretty much everyone I spoke to said that Vince McMahon Senior was a man of his word, and that Vincent McMahon Junior was not. Like plain and simple. Like that's the biggest difference. And clearly Vince Jr. idolized his father, but clearly he was also traumatized by having been ignored by his dad till he was like 15. So, and I don't, and so while Vince Sr. generally comes across well in people's descriptions, the ultimate heel move is to like ignore that you have a son for 15 years.
It's
Yeah.
true.
So like that would take some explaining, right? From Senior's part. Um, there was an article I dug up that I included in the book where Vince Jr. talks about how much affection he has, looks up to his grandfather, who was also a promoter in wrestling, Jess McMahon,
Yeah.
and his father. Uh, but so he wanted to make them proud, but Vince McMahon Jr. grew up the first 15 years of his life in the South, moving around, getting beat on by an abusive stepfather, and apparently sexually molested by his own mom. And so like Vince what Vince has done in his life is pretty reprehensible, but that being said, like he clearly had a reprehensible upbringing too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Something that's hard to kind of. There may be no more enigmatic person I've seen in terms of their existence in the public eye than Vince McMahon Jr. You feel like you know things about him, but you don't.
Right.
But then you hear the backstory and like that makes sense, but it's
Well,
not. It's not
I
a
think
reason.
he's an example of just like people, it's a cliche, but people are complicated. Like people are capable, the same person is capable of doing something very wonderful and generous and then something heinous,
Yeah,
right? And
Yeah.
it seems hard to reconcile that, but it's true all the time in life that people have multiple sides. And there are stories about Vince McMahon being very generous and very kind, right? And then there's the opposite, and they're both probably true. But I think it just goes to show you how, and this is again, no, not breaking any new ground here to say that like childhood explains so much.
Yeah.
And so much of when people get into positions of power and influence, when they make mistakes or act a certain way, it often, I think, is because of not getting what they needed when they were kids.
yeah. I went to school to be a teacher, and they told us in university. They said like, you can learn everything you want here. You're gonna taught the way you were taught, like
Right.
however you were taught as a kid. Like whatever teachers that put an imprint on you, you're gonna teach like them. I was like, well, then what am I spending all this money for? But it was true. Like essentially, like you're gonna take everything, and it's your upbringing is gonna be a big part of how you act once you get that power. And then Vince got an unfathomable amount of power over a lot of interesting and beautiful and magical people, and he was allowed to
Right.
do whatever he wanted with them. It did become a really running theme in the book. You're running through, and it's like, and Vince said this. Vince would do the opposite of this.
Right.
Or Vince would not follow up his word. I was like, it became a fun game reading the book. I'm like, and
Right.
there's Vince not
And keep in
doing a
mind,
thing
this was
again.
only writing about guys in the beginning of
Yeah,
Vince's story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, basically, this, we're ending in the early '90s, pretty much, in terms of the stories that I was telling. So, and that's before Vince got anywhere close to the power that he got later.
yeah,
Yeah. And that was before they went public, before he had to take on the government, before all this stuff.
yeah.
um, so when I guess on a to sort of switch to a more lighthearted note here, you have mentioned obviously that you deem wrestling from your childhood to be sort of a superior product to what we see today.
Well, let me
Not
just say,
not that
like,
it's not that it's worse. Not that it's worse.
yeah, right. For
Just
me,
saying.
it's more enjoyable
It's
back then.
for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I, as someone who is 26 years old and has zero comprehension over what it was like at the time, and in my rewatching of it all, have still not been able to understand it. Could you explain demolition to me?
Demolition. Okay.
I don't understand why demolition was ever popular. I
Okay.
just don't.
I'm trying to think of an analogy of the current guys that would
You
be
could go
anything.
anywhere you want with this. Music, movies, whatever you want to
Yeah. Yeah.
compare them to, go right ahead. I will never be able to understand it.
and we did a deep dive episode on demolition, and still Javier came out being like, I don't get it.
I think they
I think
suck.
I think demolition, it was simply the look,
Hmm.
and it was the clubbing style. Like when they would do that, like just like the hit, like the axe handle over and over and over on the guy, and just boom, 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 like they would pummel the guy, right? That was like, no one else did that. And so I know it may not look impressive now, but at the time, like that style of just beating on somebody over and over again, and the leather studs with the face paint, and the Rick Derringer entrance music.
Hmm.
It it the tag. You got to think about the tag teams in that era were like the British Bulldogs, the Killer Bees, the
Yeah.
Rougeau brothers, the Islanders, the Hart Foundation. I mean,
Strike
they
Force.
but they were these like very like athletic, like good worker, kind of
Yeah.
clean cut, guys that had a certain presentation. And Demolition was like just the complete opposite of all of that. So, and they were heels
Yeah.
that came in and just beat down your pretty boy baby faces, right? So that, I mean, that's the best I can do to like explain why. I mean, they were an example of a team that like so them and Jake the Snake Roberts and Rowdy Roddy Piper were heels that became so cool. It was like the Stone Cold thing.
Yeah.
The fans turned them into baby faces.
I just will always think it's like someone becoming a baseball fan in New York and choosing the Mets. Like the Road Warriors were right there,
Well,
you
okay. One
know.
other thing I was going to say was the Road Warriors, right? That's the other, but the Road Warriors like that. You could ask the same question about why the Road Warriors were popular.
Well, they were just huge. Like it's the size difference is more noticeable with the World Warriors because they were legitimately just so big.
And I also think in WWF, everybody was a larger than life athlete. So the difference between Demolition and who they were going up against was probably a little less stark than the Road Warriors versus who they were going up against.
So Javi, is it more like you're just not impressed with Bill Eadie and Barry Darso's
Yeah,
physiques?
it's not just that. Yes, I'm definitely body shaming them, but at the same time, it's I don't know. I just don't like the wrestling isn't like it never really clicked with me. I was hoping you would be able to sway me a little bit here, but honestly, I've just
No.
left this thinking more so that I would just watch the Road Warriors. Like,
Right.
And
Right.
I will say, Billy seems like a lovely man.
yes,
Just
he seems like a great
yeah,
human being. It's a shame what happened that he wasn't able to watch The Hunt for Red October that day because
I
I
like.
think that is a fantastic movie.
I think my original last line in that chapter was like, "Bill still has not seen the Hunt for Red." I was
Oh,
like, it came like the end of that chapter is very like serious, and I was like, "Oh,
yeah.
that's not going to work
what a
there."
beautiful movie that is.
It's a great movie. The other one we want to talk to you about is a person who you didn't really get the chance to talk to during the book, but you did hang out in Tampa. Is Hulk Hogan, who again
Sure.
it plays a big role in this because he is who takes the title off of the Iron Sheik after he wins it in '83. And now, what was Hulkamania like? Because
Mm.
you obviously were cheering for the Iron Sheik, so you were on the opposite side. You do say that you were still swept up
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Hulkamania at the same time.
I was, and yeah, I mean, I was too young to watch Hogan and Sheik in their match. I mean, I always
Hmm.
liked Sheik more, but I grew up, and Iron Sheik was like had his he got fired like when I was only 6, so
Yeah.
he was gone a lot, and then it was all Hogan. So I was a big Hulkamaniac, and I I don't know again like is there anyone now? I don't know this like even as popular as Cody Rhodes is, for example.
Oh, no. I don't think there's anyone that comes even relatively close to Hogan. Even
I
not
think
even on the decline, like in the 90s. Like I
right.
still think even then Hogan was probably still more popular than anyone nowadays.
I mean, part of it is that you didn't have like the contrarian smart fans that will always boo. Like,
Yeah.
there's always going to be
Yeah.
a contingent that's not going to boo, not going to cheer for the ultimate baby face, right? You didn't really have, I mean, maybe a little bit like people that cheered Paul Orndorff over Hulk Hogan. You had little bits of that here and there, but
Maybe like your
Hogan,
Savage fans were probably out there doing that, but
yeah, you had some savage. I mean, there were even some Andre the Giant fans I know back in the day.
yeah.
But I think Hogan, like, because it was so firmly, well, here's an example. Like, when I drove, I'm in Rhode Island now. I drove from California a month ago to come here, and on my way over like 9 or 10 different states, I stopped and just asked strangers on the street. I said, "I'm doing a survey. Can you name a single professional wrestler, past or present?" And I surveyed 90 people, half women, half men. I made sure to get different ethnicities and ages. And the number one answer was Hulk Hogan. The number two answer was either The Rock or John Cena.
Okay.
And of those 90 people, only two named a current wrestler, and that was Roman Reigns.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Not a single Cody Rhodes. So, like, and this
Hmm.
is like in the build up to WrestleMania. So, and this is a question I have for everybody. Like, as popular as wrestling is now, what does that say about the state of it versus what it was in the past?
I think longevity is sort of a thing that really has helped, uh, especially Hulk Hogan's legacy, The Rock's legacy. I mean, we're
Yeah.
25 years now of The Rock. We're 25 plus years of Austin. We're 40 plus years of Hogan at this
Yeah.
point. we really, as far as like the national consciousness goes, we're really what 3 years into the Cody Rhodes thing.
Right.
And for as big and popular as Cody is, amongst wrestling fans who watch the product nowadays, um, there still hasn't been enough time, or really, in my opinion, that like specific moment that has sort of been able to break him through to the national consciousness. I do think, I mean, Cody Rhodes. I'm not on TikTok, so I can't really explain, like,
Right.
give you more sorts of that. But I have friends who are not wrestling fans in any capacity who like reached out to me over WrestleMania weekend and say like, "Who's this Cody Rhodes guy? He's awesome." Like,
Right.
Yeah.
I think that Cody could get there eventually, and if there's anyone that's going to get there from like the current crop outside of Roman Reigns, I think it is Cody. Um, but again, I just think it's the longevity thing. Like,
Right.
we
I mean,
don't have that
I
time
think
with Cody.
longevity definitely matters, but I would still think that like if you did this experiment with the NBA, you would get LeBron James a lot,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right? And
And
of
that's
course
because we've had 20
he's
years
been
of him.
around a lot. Okay, that's true, but I don't think you would get
Just Bill
Michael
Russell.
Jordan more often than LeBron James.
Yeah.
Or I don't think you would get. So I guess my point is like there's something that shifted where to answer your question, Hulk Hogan was a household name in
Yeah.
1986 at his peak, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if we did this survey, if we did this experiment in 1986, I don't think you'd have all these people saying Bruno Sammartino. I think they would be
Yeah.
saying Hulk Hogan, even back then, even when he was just early in his popularity. And I think that like wrestling, like a lot of things, it doesn't occupy quite the same amount of space in the public consciousness that it did back in the 80s because there's just so much more competing with it.
Yeah.
Yes. There's definitely an oversaturation of entertainment
That's true.
out there.
I haven't had time with my own thoughts in years. I have just been looking at either big screen or little screen at all times. I want to talk about when you're doing the book and you're doing the road trip, some of the most surprising things you learned, things you didn't think you would find out, just something that really surprised you
All
when you
right,
were
so here's
doing
one
the
that I
road
was just
trip.
thinking about today that I keep forgetting to bring this up in interviews. So I think you guys are the first people I'll tell this to.
Oh, amazing. I got a scoop.
So I met with Brad Reigans. I don't know if you guys might not know who that is. Brad Reigans. He was in the AWA. He was briefly in the WWF. Never got. He was a really good amateur. He actually trained Brock Lesnar. Um,
Okay.
Oh, okay.
so,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so that might ring a yeah. So he was always like really good as a trainer. Never had the charisma to make it big. Good friends with Hulk Hogan back when in the early years of Hogan in the AWA. And he told me that like around 86, 87, when he came into the WWF, that Vince brought him in because they were going to have a Hulk Hogan like training camp, like a wrestling school. And like Hulk was like, it was going to be like a Hulk would be like the head guy training people. And that Brad was brought in because he knew Hulk really well to like kind of figure out all the details and get this thing going. And
Huh.
this is like right at the height of Hulkamania,
Yeah.
WrestleMania 3.
Okay.
And it never happened because at some point Vince McMahon, he was like, Hulk's too big. Like he just doesn't have we can't take him off the road to do this.
Yeah.
So I asked Brad if he had any of the documents from that, and he didn't have them handy. But I would love to see like what the plan was for a Hulk Hogan school back in the late 80s.
Yeah. We're getting like Hulk Hogan NXT. That sounds
Yeah.
great.
All right, guys, here's the promo. Just drink as much Red Bull as you can and start screaming about getting little kids to believe in you.
Hey, that's the Ultimate Warrior program.
So
All right.
in the book, I put in part of the promo that he cut before the Iron Sheik match.
Yeah.
And I wanted the whole thing. And again, like this is something I learned. You could call it a surprise. That this is what you guys were asking about. But when you write a book, like it was shocking to me how scared publishers are about getting sued.
Yeah.
So like they wouldn't even let me put the whole promo in because they're like it violates some copyright law to have like more than 3 lines of dialogue or something. And I was like, really? Like someone's going to sue me because I put like a 1 minute promo and
Well, Hogan might. Just
yeah.
of anyone in the industry that would do it, it would be him.
But I wish that the whole promo had been in there because it like just batshit crazy, right? It's
Yeah.
like the I mean those promos from the 80s, like just nonsense that they're. I mean, not even Ultimate War. Forget the Warrior stuff. Like just
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
regular promos.
Just yeah, what you gonna do, brother? When I'm coming to town and I'm gonna knock you out and then I'm gonna take the
He's
title
just
and then
spiking vitamin sales everywhere. So reading the book, there were a couple things that stood out to me in terms of big surprises. One, there is the story that everyone knows. Every wrestling fan, it's like the third fact everyone thinks about with WrestleMania. Howard Finkel named WrestleMania.
Right.
And then reading this book, and my world shatters. And it
Yeah.
was Rex Jones.
Rex Jones. I'm still trying to find Rex Jones. Track him down.
Yeah, that blew my mind. It's just it, and it's something that you do really well in this book. Is there's like the main story, and then there's these little asides. Here's a little thing, a little fun fact. It's a really accessible book, even if you're not a wrestling fan,
Yeah.
because
yeah.
like you do a really good job explaining a lot of the things. But then there's these little things for wrestling fans too. We're like, oh, by the way, it's not Fink who named WrestleMania. I'm like, I'm sorry,
Right.
what?
What I tried to like, again, I was cognizant the whole time of like wanting to be accessible to a general reader, but also giving little Easter eggs to wrestling fans. Like even like, a couple of times, I don't know if you noticed this, but like I would use language like, and this started the new world order of,
Yeah,
or
Yeah.
if there's a few of those where it's like it's an inside joke kind of. If
yeah,
you know wrestling
Yeah.
really well, you'll get why I chose those words.
Yeah, little nod to
Yeah.
those in the know.
yeah.
Right.
The other one is a story I had never heard of. I What was it like hearing about that plane ride?
Yeah. The original plane ride from hell.
Yes.
Um, well, that was surreal because I didn't know any of that was going to come out of my conversations. But talking to Mike Breen, who was on that flight, who was a referee, and
Yeah.
talking to Jim Troy, who was the head of that tour, and hearing about Jimmy Superfly Snuka just being absolutely insane on a commercial
Yeah.
flight and, attacking Tim White, the referee, and attacking Mike Breen, the referee. Um, and there were other things that where Snuka got detained for cocaine possession, and I mean, I have some more of those. I couldn't put everything in the book, so I have this. I'm building this website that's up now called thebradpack.com, and
Mhm.
I'm putting like the raw audio from some of these interviews on there. So if you want to hear the whole interview with Jim Troy about all the crazy Middle East stuff, like that'll be up there and because there's a lot more of that kind of thing. But yeah, I was just thinking like, what would it be like to be on that plane and have this crazed Fijian like lurching across the aisle? And the funniest part was I talk about how Snuka throws Mike Breen through the bathroom door
Yeah.
and then tries to gouge his eyes out. And then they all get up and the magnificent Morocco, who's like in storyline feuding with Snuka, he jumps in to pull everyone off. But then the Tonga kid, who's like friends with Snuka, he starts jumping in.
Yeah.
And at some point, Mike Breen realizes he's like bashing the Tonga kid against the emergency door.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's probably not good for anybody.
Yeah.
No, probably a bad idea. I also like when it's like Snuka like calms down for a couple of
Right.
hours and then he's like, round two.
He's been able to cool off, but the revenge hasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many just insane stories that came out of this book. Just insane. I mean, that's just the history of pro wrestling, where
Yeah.
it's just all insane stories. Um, when it comes to getting these, just like somehow being able to milk these stories out of people, did you feel like when you were doing these interviews, it was sort of more like you had to like prod a little bit in order to get there, or did you feel like the people that you were interviewing were sort of just willingly able to just get that right out?
No, I had to, yeah, you have to ask a certain way, or I mean, I think you have to be afraid to get rejected or to have things go sour. I mean, really, you have to like it's a little bit scary, right? But you have to take risks, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And like if I asked, I'm trying to remember an example. I'm asking Tito Santana about his relationship with his dad, he may say, well, it wasn't great. And then I could just stop, or I could be like, well, can you elaborate on that? And then, just kind of asking for more elaboration, asking follow-ups, following a thread of conversation a certain way, even if it's going in a direction that I might not have planned on. So yeah, I think I think a lot of it has to do with what questions you also choose to ask, because in a limited amount of time, again, like with someone like Tito, I didn't even ask really about like his most legendary feuds. I started out asking about his El Matador run
Mm-hmm.
and the end of his run, right? Which is probably not what he gets asked very much.
Yeah.
Nope.
But I wanted to know, like, well, what did it feel like to be 40 years old and like unemployed? What do you do? Like, what is your next step? And so, yeah, that's I guess the best way I could address that.
I thought it was interesting how it seems like a lot of wrestlers gravitate towards teaching people. I think they like having people listening to them.
Yeah,
I think they're used to being like, "Hey, I'm in charge here. Everyone listen to me. Let me cut this promo on how to do, chemistry or whatever other things they're teaching."
but interestingly, a lot of them also before they were wrestlers were not. I'm trying to think if it was anyone like no one was described as like kind of this like extroverted,
No, everyone seemed to be
out,
pretty shy.
outgoing. Yeah, like I mean, maybe like a Tony Atlas was probably pretty outgoing
Yeah.
as a kid growing
Yeah,
up.
he doesn't exactly strike me as someone who's reserved at any point in his
Right.
life.
And Hogan was described as like a performer because he was the musician, but like never
Yeah, no
even
one ever described Terry Bollea as like the guy that wants to like be seen in the room,
no.
you know. But I think music for him was the gateway to wrestling. I mean, like I think he likes the stage, but he flips a switch, and that was even true before he was Hulk Hogan. Like when he
Yeah.
was on stage, he knew how to flip that switch and be a performer on in that setting.
Yeah. As we kind of wrap up here, I want to go back to the guy who's kind of like at the heart of the book, which is the Iron Sheik.
Yeah,
And on our podcast, we cover wrestlers through 5 of the most important matches. And this week, we're going to cover the Iron Sheik because obviously we talked to you. We
yeah.
have this newfound appreciation for the Iron Sheik. If you had us watch at least one match, if there's one match you could recommend for us to watch of the Iron Sheik, what match would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I well, he was really good. It's hard to find matches from when he was really really good,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah,
which
a,
is the
a
70s.
problem we run into all of the time on this podcast.
But
I usually do my best. There's usually some sort of like probably not safe for my computer like website that's Korean or Japanese or something that's got some stuff hidden in there.
That's true.
well, so if you look at like his in 1979, he wrestled Bob Backlund. That match is pretty slow though. I mean, it's a good technical match, but he had some good matches in 1980 against like Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair when he
Ooh.
was in Mid Atlantic,
Hmm.
1980, 81. And then in terms of WWF, like his match against Tito Santana and Sergeant Slaughter in 84, those matches are pretty good. Um, like I like, there's a good like not it's not great, but like there's a good Heart Foundation versus Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov heel versus heel match from like 86 in the Boston Garden, which is kind of a weird. I was like they did these weird matches sometimes, like the heels versus heels.
Yeah.
But really like, and they're actually I've seen on YouTube, like there's like no sound, but there's a couple matches from when he was Khosrow Vaziri or Ali Vaziri in like 1973 or 75 when he's really young, and he's like doing drop kicks, and he's doing leapfrogging, and he's doing all these coming off the top rope, and so that's probably when he was the most, because you got to remember when by the time he won the belt he was already like 41.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
So
can't imagine Sheik hitting a drop kick.
yeah,
Let me tell you something. That's
Yeah,
That's
no,
gonna
it's
be a
true.
little jarring if we get that one going.
I mean, like he's got a full head of hair and he's 195 pounds and ripped and
Yeah.
totally different look.
I felt
Oof.
so bad for his wife when all of a sudden it's like, and that's the thing we don't think about with wrestlers too. Like they have people in lives and they have to look like this 24/7.
Right.
So like when Kane has to shave his head because he's getting unmasked, or Iron Sheik is going to shave his head and start doing the mustache. Like this is how they're going to live for the rest of their life, or at least and if this goes well for a long time.
Well, and that's, I mean, this is where I feel like, going to the conventions and seeing the guys that usually keep their look. It's like, that's where if I was the spouse, I'd be like, okay, once you retire, like you don't need to look like this character anymore,
Jimmy
but
The
Hart, you
mullet
don't need
can
to do your
go.
hair like this
yeah,
anymore. You
right.
don't
But
need to
back to where we started, that they don't want to let go of that character.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beyond me why
Yeah.
why they would keep the character is one thing, the look is another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing is, unfortunately, we did lose the Iron Sheik and we did lose Khosrow. And what do you miss most about him as someone who got to know him pretty well?
Well, I was really happy to see him at the end. I ended up seeing him months before he passed away. I don't miss the pseudo Twitter rants or any of that stuff. I miss like the guy that I was happy to see again in 2022, who was just like this really humble. I mean, truly humble, not making Brian Blair humble. Just like I mean, this was Khosrow Vaziri. This was a humble, kind, generous, chivalrous guy that I only saw bits and pieces of when I knew him when he was in better health. But seeing how happy his daughter Nikki and his wife Carol were to have that guy back, like
Mm-hmm.
it's not about me. I didn't know him. We weren't close like in the last many years, but I talked a lot to his daughter Nikki, and I certainly could see, having seen the worst being around Carol, like she was so, and I kind of put that in the end. She was so happy that like, oh, we're watching TV, sitting side by side together again. Like that was like the
Yeah.
best.
Yeah, it's what
That's good.
matters, right?
Yeah.
It's the part of these wrestling stories that gets forgotten about. It's the family, them getting their
Right.
their their spouse, their father, their mothers, whatever it may be, getting them back and at 100% back with the family and involved. That's really the best part of these stories that are like these sort of turnarounds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and quite the turnaround. It was a little heartbreaking to learn about the Twitter rants that it wasn't him, but I think we knew that.
We all knew. We just
I
didn't
think
want we
we
just
didn't want
it's
to
like
believe. It's like
wrestling.
Santa Claus and wrestling.
It's like
Yeah.
wrestling. We suspended our belief.
Right. I mean, that's it, right. Right to the end. It's like the book is about, okay, this is the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, the Fink didn't name WrestleMania. Iron Sheik isn't calling people jabronis on Twitter. Like,
And he
but
doesn't even hate Hulk Hogan.
he doesn't even hate
Ugh.
he doesn't hate Hulk Hogan.
It's all been a lie.
It's all been a lie. Brad, we want to thank you for joining us and talking about the book. And it was such a great read. We encourage everybody to go and pick it up. The
Yes.
six pack on the open road in search of WrestleMania, available now. Brad, tell everybody where they can find you and stuff you have to plug.
Sure. Thanks, guys. It's been a lot of fun. So yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Brad Pack Books, and as I said earlier, I have a website, thebradpack.com, where I have all the bonus material from the book. So audio from interviews and all these documents that I found, like the WWF internal documents that show all kinds of stuff from the 80s that has not been put out there, like how much this pay-per-view made or how much what the attendance was at this show, that kind of thing. So if you're really into the wrestling history, that'll be fun to look at.
And there's a lot to dive into. I'm very excited for the plane ride audio. I cannot wait for that. Obviously it's not from the plane ride, but just to hear the story from the mouth of someone who was there is going to be a lot to take in. I'm going to get my popcorn. I'm going to be ready.
Yeah.
It's going to be make a whole night of it.
Yeah.
Again, thanks, Brad, for joining us. I'll do the outro stuff. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Crossbody of Work. If you want to catch the merch, it's in the bio in the YouTube video below, as well as in the show notes of the podcast. We'll be back to cover the Iron Sheik. That's who we're covering this week, because Brad has inspired us to go and dive into his favorite wrestler, the Iron Sheik. Thanks again for joining us, Brad, and we'll talk to everybody real soon.
All right, thanks a lot.